There's a reason why Nanga Parbat in Pakistan is called the Killer Mountain. From climbers delirious with altitude sickness to daring, impossible rescue attempts to a shocking massacre. These are some of the worst deaths on the Killer Mountain. 64 people who have died trying to reach the summit of Nanga Parbat. And this is out of only 287 summit attempts. That means 22% of people who attempt Nanga Parbat lose their lives, and most will end up staying in the mountain's cold embrace for the rest of their lives. To give you a comparison, only 4% of climbers on Mount Everest lose their lives. Nanga Parbat is the 9th highest mountain on Earth. Steep slopes, challenging terrain, and the infamous Diamir face make Nanga Parbat the ultimate trial of skill, even for experienced climbers like many on this list. High in the Gilgit-Baltistan region of northern Pakistan, where the earth reaches towards the heavens, stands this giant of rock and ice. Nanga Parbat translates to Naked Mountain. It pierces the sky at 26,660 feet, marking the westernmost section of the Great Himalayan Range. Among mountaineers, it's known by a more ominous moniker, the Killer Mountain. This name wasn't earned lightly. For decades, Nanga Parbat resisted human conquest, claiming 31 lives before finally succumbing to the will of climbers with a successful summit in 1953. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In January of 2018, 2 climbers were attempting the brutal climb up the Killer Mountain, Elizabeth Rivol of France and Tomek Makiewicz of Poland. Elizabeth and Tomek were no strangers to Nanga Parbat. This was their 7th attempt to summit the mountain. It was clear that they had a passion for high-altitude climbing. Despite the dangers and previous failures, they were adamant. They were driven by a desire to conquer the peak in winter, a feat accomplished by only a handful of climbers due to the extreme cold and shifting terrain. Their expedition began, and they finally did what they had set out to do. After a challenging ascent, they reached the summit from the Diamir side. But at the summit, it was clear that Tomek was in really bad shape, and Elizabeth started taking him down. According to Elizabeth, he could not walk, see, or even communicate. And on top of that, his life force was flowing from his mouth and nose. She secured him from the wind in a crevasse. Tomek had developed severe frostbite and snow blindness. It is also believed that he was in the later stages of high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema. Elizabeth, suffering from frostbite herself, faced an agonizing decision: stay with Tomek and risk both of their lives, or descend alone to seek help. Elizabeth chose the latter, a decision that would set in motion one of the most daring rescue operations in mountaineering history. She descended as far as she could, battling the biting cold and exhaustion, until she could make contact with rescuers. Meanwhile, the distress call had reached Krzysztof Wielki, the leader of the Polish winter expedition on K2, another formidable peak in the Karakoram range. Upon hearing of the dire situation, Adam Bielecki and Denis Urubko, 2 elite climbers from the K2 expedition, volunteered to undertake the rescue mission. They were both committed to the mountaineering creed of helping those in distress, even if it meant risking their own lives. With minimal rest and preparation, they launched into the rescue, racing against time and nature. The climb to reach Elizabeth's location was nothing short of tough. Bielecki and Urubko climbed through the night, navigating the perilous terrain in near-blizzard conditions. Their experience and skills were put to the ultimate test as they ascended over 3,280 feet in the dark, guided only by the faint glimmer of headlamps and their mountaineering experience. The weather was unforgiving, with temperatures plummeting and winds howling, but they pressed on, driven by the hope of saving a fellow climber. At around 21,980 feet, they found Elizabeth, weak but alive. By the time they got to her, she weighed just 99 pounds. Her frost-bitten limbs and exhaustion were evident, but her spirit was still intact. Their relief was immediate, yet slowed by the grim reality that Tomek was still higher up the mountain, alone and in critical condition. But their primary focus now was to ensure Elizabeth's safe descent. As they began to climb down, the conditions worsened. The storm intensified, reducing visibility to almost zero and making every step a possibly fatal one. Bilecki and Urubko's mountaineering skills and their combined strength enabled them to guide Elizabeth down the treacherous slopes, one painstaking step at a time. The descent was a race against time, as every moment spent on the mountain increased the risk of further frostbite and hypothermia. Meanwhile, back at the base camp, tension and anxiety ran high. The climbing community worldwide was glued to updates, praying for a successful rescue. The complexity of the mission, the harshness of the environment, and the critical condition of the climbers made it seem like all hope was lost. After hours of effort, Bilecki and Urubko, along with Elizabeth, finally reached a point where a helicopter evacuation was possible. The relief among the rescuers and the team was immense. Elizabeth was airlifted to safety, where she received immediate medical attention. Her survival would not have been possible without the help of these rescuers and her own will to live. Now it was time for Tomek's rescue. However, this was a more complicated issue. No helicopter could fly out due to the worsening weather and the altitude. The rescuers would only be signing a death sentence if they went by foot. After a lot of deliberation, it was deemed too dangerous to attempt a rescue for Tomek. The decision, an agonizing compromise of life, was made with the rescuers' safety in mind. Tomek Makiewicz was left high on the peak, meeting a tragic end on the Killer Mountain. The rescue turned into a bittersweet story. Elizabeth Revel's survival was celebrated, but Tomek's loss was deeply mourned. Tributes poured in, honoring his adventurous spirit and the incredible bond he shared with the mountains. For Elizabeth Revel, the experience was transformative. Her survival against all odds showed her resilience and the incredible bravery of her rescuers. For the families and friends of Tomek Makiewicz, the mountain now holds a sacred place, the final resting spot for a climber whose spirit will forever be part of Nanga Parbat. It was July of 2023. An ambitious push for the summit of Nanga Parbat was underway. The teams had chosen to skip the establishment of Camp 4, typically set at around 24,278 feet, and instead launched their attempts from Camp 3, situated at 22,310 feet. This decision would prove to be deadly for climbers attempting to summit without extra oxygen. Among those attempting the summit without oxygen were 3 Polish climbers: Piotr Krzyzowski, Paweł Kopecz, and Waldemar Waldy Kowalewski. All 3 of these climbers reached the summit that day, but not all of them would make it back down alive. They were joined by many other climbers wanting to feel the glory of reaching the top of Nanga Parbat. While there was no formal Camp 4, a climber named Saulius Demulevicius and an Italian team led by pitched tents around. They were well acclimatized and set up their informal Camp 4 at 24,115 feet, a move that would soon reveal its significance. But as they prepared for their own summit bid, they found their tent transformed into an emergency aid station for struggling climbers descending from the summit. There were an unusual number of climbers suffering from frostbite that day, thanks to the plummeting temperatures. Flor Cuenca of Peru, an experienced climber who summited Nanga Parbat without oxygen, passed several climbers in distress on her descent. She witnessed the consequences of the commercial team's decision to forego Camp 4. Starting from Camp 3 meant a much longer climb up, and even more significantly, back down. Climbers were exhausted, frostbitten, and some were hallucinating due to altitude sickness. The Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Azerbaijani team sacrificed their own summit attempt to assist those in need. Demulevicius recalled the chaos. A chilling radio call for help echoed through the storm, reporting climbers in severe distress. The 3 Polish climbers, Piotr Krzyzowski, Paweł Kopecz, and Waldemar Waldy Kowalewski, had all managed to make it to the summit at different times. None of them had used supplemental oxygen, an impressive feat. but the journey down Killer Mountain proved to be too challenging. Valdy Kowalewski is no longer oriented. He needs help descending. Pavel has altitude sickness. He no longer knows his name. Damulevicius then radioed for someone to bring oxygen for Pavel Kopech. Damulevicius said that frozen climbers begin to pour into the vestibule of their tent. A raging blizzard filled the tent with snow. We serve everyone tea and try to get a handle on the situation by asking for information. Around midnight, we understood that it was Chaba, who needed help going down, and that Pavel was probably still in the greatest danger. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, Damulevicius and his team were scheduled to leave for the summit, a plan they had long forgotten in their heroic attempts to help other disoriented and sick climbers. A climber outside their tent let them know that Pavel Kopech, still waiting for oxygen to arrive from a lower camp, had made it nearby but needed help. Then the climber continued the descent to C3. The storm continued to rage, and climbers in need of rescue struggled to reach safety. Pavel Kopech needed serious help. Other climbers attempted to assist him, but Kopech's condition worsened. Cuenca's experiences added to the terrible story. She encountered more climbers in dire conditions and even found a high-altitude porter, Akbar, totally abandoned in the snow at Camp 3. She offered him shelter and fuel, appalled by the treatment of the local climbers. As climbers reached the summit and began their descent, the storm's intensity grew. Damulevicius and his team continued to help those in need, including another climber who was found disoriented and without gloves. Despite their exhaustion, they heroically provided tea, warmth, and shelter to the struggling climbers. The night at the informal Camp 4 was long and cold. Pavel Kopech was laying at 24,278 feet. He had collapsed just 600 feet away from the tent, looking bad. They tried to help him to his feet, but his legs didn't work. Damulevicius went to look for help. On the way, he found yet another puzzled climber who was delirious and trying to dig a platform for a tent. He took him to a tent nearby, where he would be taken care of. Then he went to the other tent and found 3 experienced climbers to try to assist Pavel Kopech. He told them he needed physical help dragging Kopech. Then he went to his own tent to gather items to tow the sick climber. These items were a rope, a mat, and a thermos with hot water. It took him 40 minutes to get back to Kopech. By the time Damulevicius got back, the situation had worsened. He said, "Pavel is lying peacefully in the arms of Lanko, who is sitting next to him. Both are breathing normally. I pour Pavel a cup of hot water. We constantly talk to Pavel, encouraging him and telling him that it is necessary to reach the tent. Realizing that we may not get any help, we try to lift Pavel again and pull him down. Vladimir and I immediately look at each other, because we both sense at the same time that something is wrong. Pavel is not breathing. We try to shake him and revive him, but in vain. Pavel Kopech died in my arms on July 3rd at 3:19 a.m. Assistance from Camp 4 and the requested oxygen cylinder from Camp 3 never arrived. The events on Nanga Parbat prompted reflection within the high-altitude climbing community. The chaos and tragedy showed the need for better preparedness, a sensible assessment of one's abilities, and a renewed commitment to helping fellow climbers. While it's true that helping other climbers could put you in a tough spot, sometimes helping them only means giving up your own summit attempt. Is summiting a mountain more important than someone's life? Now let's go back in time and take a look at a German-backed expedition that turned into a tragedy. 10 lives were lost on Nanga Parbat in what was one of the deadliest mountaineering disasters at the time. It was 1934, just a few years before the start of World War II. Willy Merkel's expedition to Nanga Parbat was a meticulously planned and well-financed endeavor. Backed by the newly established Nazi regime, Merkel's team included some of the most experienced climbers of the time. Their goal was ambitious: to be the first to conquer Nanga Parbat. Merkel assembled a team of 9 other climbers and 35 experienced Sherpa porters. An additional 600 local porters were hired to carry 570 loads of equipment on the 200-mile journey to the base of the mountain. After a 17-day trek through snow-covered mountain passes, the team established base camp at 13,000 feet in Fairytale Meadow. From there, they began the arduous task of establishing higher camps and ferrying supplies up the mountain. The expedition made good initial progress, quickly setting up camps 2 and 3. However, the first tragedy struck on June 7th, when climber Alfred Drexel developed severe altitude sickness at Camp 3. Despite efforts to bring him down and provide medical care, Drexel died of pulmonary edema the next day. His death was sobering and reminded everyone on the expedition of the potential dangers that they faced. After a delay to bury Drexel, the team pressed on. By June 22nd, they had established Camp 4 at 20,000 feet to serve as their advanced base camp. From there, they tackled increasingly difficult terrain, setting up camps 5 and 6 on the steep slopes leading to Rakhiot Peak. On July 4th, the team reached Camp 6 at 22,800 feet. With good weather and steady progress, they estimated they were just 3 or 4 days from the summit. However, the extreme altitude was taking its toll, and several porters had to descend due to sickness. On July 6th, 5 European climbers and 11 porters set out for the Silver Saddle at 23,500 feet. They established Camp 7 in this area, believing they were just hours from the summit. But that night, a ferocious storm hit the mountain. For 2 days, hurricane-force winds and heavy snow trapped the climbers in their tents. On July 8th, with conditions worsening and supplies dwindling, Merkel ordered everyone to descend to Camp 4. The descent quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. Blinding snow reduced visibility to just 30 feet, and the wind threatened to tear climbers from the mountain. The group became separated in the chaos. 2 European climbers and 3 porters formed an advance team to break the trail ahead. They managed to reach Camp 4 that evening, but the rest of the group never arrived. Over the next several days, small groups of survivors struggled down the mountain in horrific conditions. During this time, the worst started to occur. Many climbers and porters began to succumb to exposure, exhaustion, or falls during this ordeal. Some made it as far as Camps 5 or 6 before succumbing to the elements. Others became trapped in higher camps, unable to descend through the deep snow and fierce winds. On July 12th, rescuers from Camp 4 finally managed to reach Camp 5, but the storm forced them back down. They watched helplessly as lone figures occasionally appeared on the ridge above, slowly making their way down. Incredibly, on July 14th, a single porter stumbled into Camp 4. After battling the storm for nearly a week, he reported that expedition leader Willie Merkel and 1 other porter were still alive somewhere below Camp 7. Rescuers made desperate attempts to reach them on July 15th and 16th, but chest-deep snow made progress impossible. When the storm finally cleared days later, Merkel's body was found near the Rakhiot steps. His loyal porter, who likely stayed behind to help Merkel, was never found. In total, the 1934 Nanga Parbat disaster claimed 10 lives, 4 European climbers and 6 porters. The last survivor, Ang Sering, endured over a week of brutal conditions before reaching safety. The 2 final victims likely perished shortly after his rescue. By July 22nd, all camps were removed from the mountain. The expedition's failure and tragic loss of life shocked the world. Willie Merkel's brother Carl later wrote that, "The sheer protracted agony has no parallel in mountaineering history." The 1934 Nanga Parbat expedition reminds us of the extreme dangers faced by high-altitude mountaineers, the unpredictable nature of mountain weather, the debilitating effects of altitude, and the thin line between triumph and tragedy in such hostile environments are all factors every mountaineer has to face. The disaster also raised questions about the ethics of exposing porters and support staff to such risks. While the European climbers chose to accept the dangers, many of the porters were simply seeking much-needed income to support their families. Despite this, attempts to climb Nanga Parbat continued. The mountain would not be successfully summited until 1953. nearly 2 decades after Merkel's ill-fated expedition. While this expedition saw many tragic events, nothing can compare to the Nanga Parbat incident of 2013. On a warm summer night, nearly 60 years after that first triumphant ascent, the mountain would bear witness to a tragic event, not born of its treacherous slopes, but of human actions. June 22, 2013. The sun had long since dipped behind the towering peaks, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and indigo. At the base camp nestled at the foot of Nanga Parbat's imposing west face, a diverse group of international climbers was settling in for the night. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began their ascent. Chen Liu, a Chinese-American climber, zipped up his tent and let out a contented sigh. He'd dreamed of this moment for years, and now, finally, he was here. In nearby tents, his fellow adventurers, hailing from Ukraine, China, Slovakia, Lithuania, Nepal, and Pakistan, were going through their own evening rituals. The local Pakistani porters, instrumental in getting the expedition this far, chatted quietly around small fires, their laughter occasionally carried on the crisp mountain air. None of them could have imagined the events about to unfold. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the peace of the camp was broken. A group of men, numbering close to 20 and clad in military gear, emerged from the darkness. At least 16 of them carried rifles. Their shouts in heavily accented English cut through the night. "Taliban! Al-Qaeda! Surrender!" Confusion reigned as climbers were roughly pulled from their tents. Chen Liu, realizing the grave danger they were in, made a split-second decision. As one of the armed men approached, Chen lunged from his tent, tackling the assailant. In the ensuing struggle, a shot was fired. Chen went limp, marking the start of the tragic night. In the chaos that followed Chen's fall, another climber saw a chance for survival. Zhang Zhengchuan, his heart pounding, burst from his tent and sprinted towards a nearby trench. Zigzagging to avoid the bullets, Zhang somehow made it to safety, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camp. The remaining climbers were rounded up, their hands bound behind their backs. Forced to kneel on the cold, hard ground, they watched in fear as their captors ransacked the camp, seizing passports, wallets, radios, and satellite phones. The local porters were gathered separately, spared for the moment but no less frightened. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Without warning, the armed men opened fire on the kneeling climbers. The bursts of rifle fire shattered the mountain's silence, echoing off the looming face of Nanga Parbat. Their leader walked among the fallen climbers, ensuring there were no survivors. In a twisted act of mercy, or perhaps calculated self-preservation, the militants spared one climber. Sher Khan, a Pakistani who had descended from Camp 1 earlier that day due to illness, was allowed to live. The local porters, too, were largely spared, save for one. Ali Hussein, a cook, was executed for the crime of being a Shiite Muslim. As suddenly as they had appeared, the attackers melted back into the night. By 4 a.m. on June 23rd, they were gone, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable tragedy. 11 people lay in the shadow of the mountain they had come to climb. The remoteness that draws climbers to Nanga Parbat now worked against the survivors. Help wouldn't arrive until dawn, when a Pakistani military helicopter finally reached the base camp around 7:30 a.m. By then, the world was waking up to news of the incident, and the shockwaves were only beginning. Why did this terrible event occur, and who were the men responsible? The Taliban quickly claimed responsibility, framing the attack as retaliation for the U.S. killing of one of their high-ranking commanders. But this explanation did little to soften the blow or make sense of the senseless violence. Gilgit-Baltistan, the region surrounding Nanga Parbat, had long been considered safe for tourists and climbers. This attack shattered that illusion and sent the Pakistani government scrambling to respond. Under immense pressure both domestically and internationally, Pakistani authorities launched a massive manhunt. The rugged terrain that had sheltered the attackers now became a maze to be combed by security forces. Their efforts bore fruit quickly. On June 26th, they arrested a local man believed to be one of the attackers in the nearby town of Chilas. Later that same day, another militant was apprehended. The investigation continued at a feverish pace. By July the 15th, authorities announced the arrest of a fourth attacker, though his identity was not disclosed. But the militants weren't going down without a fight. On August 7th, the Taliban struck back in an ambush that cost more lives. This brazen attack only hardened the resolve of the Pakistani government. The National Army was deployed to Gilgit-Baltistan, turning the picturesque region into a militarized zone. Their presence seemed to turn the tide. On August 19th, officials triumphantly announced that all 20 men involved in the Nanga Parbat attack had been arrested. Among those in custody was the alleged mastermind, Karibullah, leader of the Chilas sect of the Taliban. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, a chilling picture emerged. The original plan, they believed, had been to rob the climbers and kidnap Chen Honglu, the Chinese American, to use as leverage in negotiations with the U.S. But when Chen was killed in the initial struggle, Karibullah reportedly flew into a rage and ordered the execution of all the climbers. Justice, it seemed, had been swift and comprehensive. But in the complex world of Pakistani politics and law enforcement, things are rarely as they appear. A year after the attack, troubling reports began to surface. Of the 20 men initially arrested, only 5 remained in police custody. Even more disturbing were the claims of one of the original investigators, who claimed only one of those still held was actually connected to the Nanga Parbat attack. The rest, he alleged, had been forced to confess. The final twist in this tragic tale came on February 27, 2015. In a daring escape attempt at the Gilgit-Baltistan district jail, one of the Nanga Parbat attackers managed to flee. Habibur Rahman, his name now known to the world, vanished into the rugged landscape. As of the latest reports, he remains at large, a ghostly reminder of that blood-soaked night on Killer Mountain. In the years since the attack, Nanga Parbat has continued to draw climbers, its siren call too powerful to resist. But for those who know its history, the mountain now carries an additional weight. It stands not just as a test of human endurance and skill, but as a monument to lives cut tragically short and dreams left unfulfilled. The events of June 22, 2013 show the fragility of life and the depths of human cruelty. But they also highlight the resilience of the human spirit. Climbers still come to test themselves against the killer mountain, refusing to let fear extinguish the flame of adventure. As the sun sets behind Nanga Parbat each evening, painting the snow-capped peak in shades of gold and crimson, one can't help but pause and remember. Remember the lives lost, the bravery shown, and the enduring allure of the mountains that continue to call us despite the risks and tragedies. For in those towering peaks, we find not just challenge and danger, but also beauty, peace, and a connection to something greater than ourselves. And so the story of Nanga Parbat continues, written in rock and ice, blood and courage, a testament to the complexity of the human experience in the face of nature's grandest creations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.